Welcome to the Pennsylvania Department of Education's Accelerated Learning Series for School Administrators. This is an asynchronous recorded session where we will focus on how school leaders can design a system of scaffolded supports to meet the unique needs of all students. The intent of providing scaffolded support through academics, behavior, and social emotional competencies is to accelerate learning for all students through an equitable and trauma informed lens, thus decreasing current skill gaps. In this session, we will take time to explore strategic and intensive supports as part of a continuum of scaffolded supports. What are some key components that school leaders need to consider in designing a system of scaffolded supports? First, it is important to consider that some students will require more intensive scaffolded support in addition to the support provided during core instruction and class-wide intervention. Other sessions in this series provide information for strategies to maximize impact of core instruction. Additionally, there is another session focused on how to implement class-wide supports. Data can help schools identify students in need of strategic, secondary, and intensive tertiary support and provide intervention matched to specific skills in need of improvement. Potential data sources may include, but are not limited to, universal academic and social emotional behavioral screenings, classroom data, formative assessments, and other sources. These data can help school teams identify students in need of additional supports.
So what are strategic supports? Strategic or secondary supports are provided in addition to core instruction for some students, approximately 10 to 15% of students, when data indicate there is a similar category of need. For example, maybe computational fluency with sums to 20, or maybe there's a similar behavioral skill that's in need of development for small groups of students. Strategic supports can be provided to small groups of students that have a similar category of need. It's important to consider evidence-based interventions. These should be provided to address that identified category of need. So what are intensive supports? Intensive or tertiary supports, in addition to core instruction, are provided to a few students, approximately 5% or less of the student population. These are the students with the most intensive needs. Intensive supports are highly individualized. The most intensive evidence-based interventions need to be provided for the most relevant skill deficits. So when might we provide strategic supports? Strategic or secondary supports are provided in addition to core instruction for some students. So strategic supports do not replace core instruction. These are provided to small groups of students that have a similar category of need. Some key features to keep in mind. Again, they're provided to approximately 10 to 15% of students when the data indicate there is a similar category of need. So when we think about the provision of strategic and intensive supports, resource allocation is an essential component. So if we have a large number of students who require additional supports, do we have capacity as a school to provide strategic and intensive supports to say 50 or 60% of our student population? Most schools do not have these types of human capital as well as physical resources to provide these supports. If you have large percentages of students who are in need of additional supports, please take a few minutes to check out the session on class-wide supports. So again, strategic supports are provided in addition to core instruction and are best provided when it's 10 to 15% of the student population are needing these types of support. When there are more students than that, we may want to consider class-wide supports for equitable, efficient, and effective allocation of resources. So what about intensive supports? Intensive or tertiary supports are provided to a few students, 5% or less. These are the students with the most intensive needs. It can be for behavioral, it can be for academic need. But again, this intensive supports don't replace core instruction. These are provided in addition to core. Intensive supports are highly individualized and are dependent upon the needs of the student. They need to be provided for the most relevant skill deficits. What are those skills that are essential for future learning or future social, emotional, and behavioral success? So some key features, again, approximately 5% or less of students who are identified as being at significant risk for meeting basic necessary skills that are essential for future success. These are intensive, individualized, and again, provided in addition to core instruction. So how might we provide these supports? Let's think about strategic supports first. Remember, this is 10 to 15% of students with a similar need. We want to use evidence-based interventions to address the identified category of need. So academically, we might find things like a standard protocol intervention that has good evidence that this intervention works to target that identified need for small groups of students. When we think about social, emotional, and behavioral needs, these might be some examples of check-in groups, different mentoring programs, being able to identify safe spaces, or SAP referrals. SAP is the Student Assistance Program, and it is in Pennsylvania designed to help remove barriers to student learning. But these all may be examples of social, emotional, and behavioral strategic supports. Again, groups of students with similar categories of need. So a few key features when we look at strategic support, again, students, based on data, have a similar need. And so these interventions are provided to address that category of need. There are more frequent opportunities for corrective feedback. So whether it is an academic intervention or a behavioral intervention, students are provided with additional opportunities for feedback about their performance. They are given additional opportunities for practice with not only immediate, but also delayed corrective feedback. And the task content is more narrowly defined. Again, we're working on some of those skills necessary for future success. So the content of the task may be more narrowly defined than what we see in our core academic or behavioral instruction. So how do we provide supports that are intensive in nature? So number one, we want to be able to determine the sequence of skills, whether those are academic or behavioral skills that students need to master. Again, these are the most essential skills tied to future success. We need to be able to have some type of enhanced assessment of academic functioning when we're looking at academic needs to determine the root cause. So for example, this might be a diagnostic assessment. Maybe in mathematics, we're doing a survey level assessment to find the most prerequisite computation skill where a student is experiencing difficulty. As we think about how we provide intensive supports, explicit instruction is important to be designed and provided to establish accurate responding, as well as conceptual understanding that requires modeling. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about explicit instruction, there is a session in this series dedicated all to explicit instructional techniques. As we think about providing intensive supports, we are having very narrowly defined instructional target, and we may be providing instruction on lower level and prerequisite skills. These may be skills that are outside of a student's grade level. Again, we want to really target those skills that are necessary for future success. For behavioral needs, it may be important to determine the function or what's the purpose of that behavior and conditions under which a behavior of concern occurs. That will be critical in determining the approach to provide intensive supports for significant behavioral needs. So what are some key features as we provide the most intensive supports to a small percentage of students? Number one, they're highly individualized. It may or may not be a standard protocol intervention. It's going to be individualized dependent upon where the student is performing in a sequence of skills. Intensive supports should be provided daily. There is increasingly involved corrective feedback. So students receiving the most intensive supports need many opportunities for immediate corrective feedback. There are also built-in guided practice opportunities, whether that may be academics or with behavior and social emotional skills, with more narrowly defined task content. And that would gradually be accelerated based upon the student's individual gains. So what are some considerations that we may need to take into account as school leaders to be able to provide a continuum of strategic and intensive supports? First, it's important to assess the ability for the school or the district to be able to collect and analyze data to determine which students need strategic and intensive supports. Again, there may be a number of data sources, universal screening data for academics or social and emotional behavioral skills, formative assessment data. There are a number of data sources schools can evaluate to determine which students need strategic and intensive supports. It is also important to determine a plan when we're thinking about strategic supports to consider the category of the problem. For example, if we have a group of students missing computational fluency skills for sums to 20, and then what type of intervention is designed to specifically target and improve that skill. Finally, it is very helpful to take inventory of what interventions are already available in the district or school to be able to mitigate strategic and intensive need, ensuring appropriate match. It might be helpful to take a small team and map out a resource inventory of everything that you have available and look, does it target reading skills? Does it target math skills, behavioral skills, or social emotional skills? Match it to the skill as well as the need, and then that will help determine what is available. And think outside the box. Bring in your specialists, bring in your special educators. Sometimes they have resources that the full team isn't aware of. So taking inventory of available interventions can be very helpful. As we think about resource allocation, it is important to assess the human capital. What staff do you have available who are able to provide targeted and intensive support to students? And remember, this is provided in addition to core instruction and supports. So you may think outside the box a little bit. Perhaps you have some specialists such as speech and language pathologists or school psychologists that may be able to provide some additional support. Maybe it is reallocating the human capital that you already have in your building to align with the data and with the needs of students. But it is important as you think about the provision of strategic and intensive supports to determine who is actually available to provide those targeted and intensive supports. Additionally, aligning practice through the process of assess, analyze, interpret, instruct, reflect, and monitor to be able to monitor student progress and determine when supports need to be intensified for students who are not making adequate progress, or ideally, we would like to see students make adequate progress and have supports be faded or removed for those students who are meeting and exceeding the goals based upon the data and the data analysis cycle.
On your accelerated learning guide, you will find links to a number of resources for you to explore to learn more about strategic and intensive supports. The Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistant Network has many resources on its website to assist LEAs in establishing and sustaining a comprehensive multi-tiered system of supports, MTSS, for academic, social emotional learning, and behavior. The National Center on Intensive Intervention provides guidance on a research validated process for individualizing academic and behavioral interventions for students with the most intensive needs. The National Center on Intensive Intervention, for example, has a resource defining the dimensions of the taxonomy of intervention intensity and considerations for English learners, provides a great resource on supporting English learners through strategic and intensive supports. This two-page handout highlights how to use the taxonomy of intervention intensity when selecting, evaluating, and intensifying interventions for students who are English learners. Specific considerations for these English learners are provided across the dimensions of strength, dosage, alignment, attention to transfer, comprehensiveness, behavior, support, and individualization. Oh my goodness. Thank you for attending this asynchronous session, Scaffolded Supports, Strategic and Intensive Supports. Submit your attendance for this session using the Google form and typing in your browser tinyurl.com/capital P, capital D, capital E, accelerate. If you are unable to open the tinyurl link, use the link provided to the form. You may also access the attendance form by scanning this QR code with your smartphone or device. Both links and the QR code direct you to the same form. The exit code for this session is 84975. Again, the exit code for this session is 84975. Thank you so much for attending this session.
You sound great, Ben.